Where do you find your quilt inspiration? Do you find your inspiration from patterns you see? Do you find your inspiration from your fabric first and then look for a pattern? Do you find inspiration from nature or from photographs you may have? For me, there can be a variety of different ways that I find inspiration for a new quilt I want to make. And this time I actually found inspiration from an ad. I was scrolling on Facebook and this ad popped up for a quilt to purchase, and it's from a big chain store, but I fell in love with the design. It's very, very simple, but I of course said, I can make that. And the funny thing is just a few days before, I was in a quilt shop looking for thread and found this layer cake that I just knew would be perfect for the pattern that I saw in the ad. So I decided to get to work. Hi, my name is Fallon and I love to quilt. I share a lot of different quilting tutorials here on YouTube, and if you find yourself loving quilting and are looking for inspiration or different pattern ideas, I would love for you to subscribe to my channel if you aren't already. Today, I'm going to show you how to use just one layer cake to make a half square triangle quilt that is on point. It's going to be a lot of fun, and we like to keep things as simple as we can here. So let's get started on it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to sort this layer cake into light, medium, and dark prints. So I'm just going to go through and pull out the fabrics that I feel are light, and then medium, and then dark. Now there are going to be some that could fit into more dark category and some that may go over into the lights more. I'm going to play with them a little bit and just make sure I like how everything goes together. After sorting the layer cake into light, medium, and dark fabrics, you will want to pull out 32 squares. Now these 32 squares are going to be made into half square triangles using the 2 at a time method. So all layer cakes out there are going to have a different variety of fabrics that are light, medium, and dark, and maybe some won't even have a real variety of light, medium, and dark. Usually they do, but it really depends on the layer cake. So do the best you can with taking 16 colors that have a good contrast with 16 other colors to really make the half square triangles stand out. So I was pretty lucky here in that I had 14 fairly dark fabrics. So I pulled out 7 medium colored fabrics and 7 light colored fabrics to pair up with those. And then to get the 16 of each, I pulled out 2 that are medium to pair with 2 that are light to make sure I still have contrast between the 2 of them. Now we're also going to need 7 squares that are going to be cut in half. These are going to be used for setting triangles on the quilt. And then we're also going to need to pull out 1 square that is going to be cut into quarters, and that is going to be used on the corners of the quilt. Now you're going to have 2 squares left over, so you keep them close on hand because you may want to use them because there is a point when some fabrics just don't look great together and you may want to cut one of those in half for setting triangles, or if you don't want the same corners on each edge of the quilt, you may want to cut another square into corners to use there. All right, so take your ruler and your marking utensil. I'm just going to use a regular pencil and mark corner to corner on the lightest fabric just so that you can see the line you make. And then you're just going to put your fabrics right sides together. You could pop some pins in here if you want to. And then you're just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along both sides of that drawn line. All right, so after sewing along each side of that drawn line, we're going to do a quick press. So just press that nice and flat to make sure everything is nice and even. And then after that quick press, you're going to cut right down along the center between those 2 lines. And you should have a 1/4 inch seam or a scant 1/4 inch seam between the two. So now you have your half square triangle. And of course, since it's the 2 at a time method, you'll have 2 half square triangles. We do need to press them and trim them up though. All right, so to press, I like to press along the seam and then gently press over, just kind of start guiding it along there. I don't like to press too much because since this is a bias seam through there, it can get a little wonky. So I just gently press it. Isn't this fabric just so pretty? I'm so excited about this quilt. And I have a little surprise for you coming later with it, just to kind of give it a little more fun. So I'm just gonna go ahead and have both of these here and press both of them. Press it over gently. And like I said, these seams can get wonky really fast, really easy, so just be gentle with them. So after getting all 32 of these 2 at a time half square triangles sewn and cut in half and pressed, you're going to want to trim them up to 9.5 inch squares. I'm going to keep it really simple. I have a 9.5 inch ruler that I'm going to line up on the half square triangle and just trim around it on a rotating cutting mat. If you have another method you like to use, go ahead and use that. If you don't like the method I'm using, or if you don't have a 9.5 inch square, there are so many tutorials out there that show so many different methods for trimming up half square triangles, and you are sure to find one that fits your style if this one doesn't. So I have a 9.5 inch ruler, and honestly, this is not the best ruler for trimming up half square triangles because you'll notice something. It's kind of weird. This one does not have one that goes across the center of the ruler. That is so helpful if you have one that does that. I do not, so I'm just gonna make do with what I have. So I line this up on here, and what I try to do is get the corner of the ruler on both sides at the corner of my diagonal seam here for the half square triangle. Once I get it lined up, I'm going to hold it in place and trim 2 sides. Now, one thing you might see here is that my fabric is curving up. I didn't press it really well, so I'm going to do that really quick. Pressing in quilting is so important. Just a little tidbit for you. I didn't like to press when I first started sewing when I was a teenager, and I would make quilts, and it was very difficult to sew things together. I never really understood why until I started learning more about quilting. So press your seams, press your fabric. It makes a world of a difference. All right, so now that I fixed that, everything's lining up well. I can see a little bit of fabric peeking out around all sides, so I know I'm gonna get this all trimmed up nicely. So I'm going to cut along one side, and since I feel comfortable going ahead and cutting across the top of it, I'm going to do that as well. Now I am not going to touch my ruler, and I'm just going to gently rotate my mat so that I have one side that hasn't been trimmed to the right of me and one across the top, and then I'm going to hold back down on this ruler and trim across the side and the top again. And then we should have a nicely trimmed up 9.5 inch half square triangle. So here is an alternative way to trim up the half square triangles. I asked my husband to make me this 9.5 inch trim lock, and you just line up the diagonal line on the half square triangle. Make sure you have some excess around each side. And then you have the handle here to hold it in place. It's a nice 1/4 inch thick ruler, so it's nice and heavy. So I just trim along 2 sides. I have the rotating mat here to make it easier. Turn and trim along 2 sides. Easy peasy, right? I mean, it really isn't hard. It's just a little bit of extra work to put in to get everything to line up really nicely. I mean, you saw not much got trimmed off of this at all. And I honestly used to skip this step too. There was a lot of steps I used to just skip in quilting. But that little bit of fabric really makes a difference if you want everything to line up nicely. So get all 32 of these trimmed up, and then we will talk layout. Now, if you remember with my Argyle quilt pattern, I talked about how I do not love to sew quilts on point, and that has not changed. I do not like sewing quilts on point at all. It is just not fun for me. Something with the layout kind of plays with my brain. However, sometimes I come across patterns where I really love the look of it and I really want to make it. So I have to just go a little bit slower, pay a little more attention, and make it happen. And this is one of those patterns. It is a pretty simple pattern. I mean, it just takes simple half square triangles and turns them on point. So I'm going to walk you through how I put a quilt together that is on point and give you a few tips along the way. So hopefully, if it is harder for you to do this as well, you can find a way to make that pattern you've been eyeing but have maybe been avoiding, or maybe even make this pattern with me. So after you get all of the blocks finished, lay out your blocks on a design wall or on a floor or on a bed, wherever you can, just so that you can see how the layout may come together. So all your half square triangles are going to go in rows, and you'll have setting triangles to fill in the rest. Then you'll start piecing these rows together on the diagonal. So I'm going to show you what I find to be the easiest way to make that happen. All right, so I settled for a layout that I love. And now it's time to start sewing together the rows. That really can be a little bit difficult, but what I found that works best for me is to start at a corner, and I like to start at the corner that is on the top right of the quilt. It may feel more comfortable for you to work in a different direction, so start in a corner and kind of use the methods that I show you. Play around. Maybe if you've already always started in the top left corner and worked and it really does not work out for you doing that, maybe the top right will work better for you, or one of the bottom corners. Just kind of test the waters and see what you think works well for you. So laid out here is the corner pieces that I like to start with. Now, the first thing I do is fold my square here in half, and I will crease it. If you need to use an iron to get a good crease so you can see it, go ahead and do that. So I put a crease in, and then I'm going to do the same thing with this piece here. I'm going to fold it and crease it. So you want to fold it exactly in half. Now this is the part I think really plays with my head a lot, because with all these triangles, these setting triangles and the corner triangles, they don't really line up the way you intuitively think they should. I feel like it makes the most sense for my pieces to line up where the corners come together, right? But then over here it's hanging off. So you kind of feel like maybe I can just put it wherever. No, the easiest thing to do is to crease it, find the center of both, and then put them right sides together, line up those creases and pop a pin in there and sew your 1/4 inch seam. And then the thing that makes it even more confusing is that this corner triangle is different from the setting triangles. So I'll show you that after we get this one sewn. All right, so I have that sewn. I have the 1/4 inch seam there, and then I pressed it over. Now here's where it gets tricky. And as long as you remember this for every single row, you'll get it right every single time. Now here, instead of folding this in half, pressing and folding this block in half and pressing and finding the center, all you have to do is find that right angle of the setting triangle. Line up that right angle with the edge of your block, and you're going to have overhang here. That is okay. And that's what kind of plays with my head a little bit, is being okay with that. I feel like my block's not lining up right, but it is okay. So line up that right angle with the block and then pop some pins in here. So I'm going to put 3. I'm going to put one right where I start sewing, right in the middle, and then right at the end over here. And then sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. I'm going to go ahead and press it as well too. All right, so that seam is sewn and pressed, and look how it just lines up really well. It's even going over a little bit over here, right? Like it goes past that 1/4 inch. It's a little off. Just be okay with it being a little off. That edge over there on the outside of the quilt is going to be a little bit wonky. Don't stress about it. I know it's hard. I get it, it's hard, but don't stress about it, because what we're gonna do is once we get this quilt top finished, once we get it basted and quilted, we'll trim all that up and you won't even notice anymore that it was ever off. What we're going to focus on is the rows being straight, everything lining up within the rows, and then as we bring all the rows together on the diagonal, we're gonna worry about the points of the block, not the edge of it, because we're gonna trim that up later. I promise you it'll all work out. Okay, so this other setting triangle here, we're going to line that up. And it's that right angle of the setting triangle again, right? We're gonna line that up with the edge of our half square triangle block, and that will keep everything perfectly in line. Pop some pins in here. And we're gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam across here and then press that as well. All right, so there we go. We have this other one lined up, and see, this row is completely straight, which is perfect. That's what we need. It's off over here, and it's even farther off than this one here. Like I said, we're not gonna worry about that. Don't worry about it at all. We're gonna figure that out in the end. So let's work on the next row in this quilt so I can show you how to bring the rows together. So the next row has more than what I can really fit on camera. So I'm gonna kind of layer them a little bit so you can see what I need to do here. Now we're going to work this row the same that we did before, but we're just gonna have more blocks in it. Normally what I would do with a quilt when I have rows is I would put a marking pin on the first row. You've probably seen me do this before. Put a marking pin that it's like row 1, right? And then I'll stack all the blocks up nicely, take them over to my sewing machine, just sew them all. Maybe I'll have a picture with me of the layout just so I can refer to it every now and then, make sure everything's, you know, turned right, whatever it is. Here, I don't do that. I work really slow and I kind of work one seam at a time. I want to really make sure I get this right because this isn't a way that I normally bring a quilt together. It's much easier when the row is lined up straight than when it's on the diagonal like this, at least in my opinion. So for me, with quilts like this, working slower always means the seam ripper comes out less. So here we find that right angle. We're gonna line it up and then sew that 1/4 inch seam across here. I'm gonna pop some pins in just because I don't want to accidentally, so here's why I put pins in when I don't normally pin. I put pins in here because by the time I get over to the sewing machine from where I have this laid out, I could easily think I'm supposed to sew across here. I don't want to accidentally sew across there. I want to sew here. So if I put the pins in, by the time I get over to the sewing machine, I'm not going to be confused. So after I get that sewn and pressed and it's looking beautiful, I'll add on the next square. So we're going to do this with every single row, and those rows are going to be on the diagonal. The main thing we're going to remember is these setting triangles. Those you line up straight across the edge, the right angle of the triangle you line up with the block. That's what we need to remember there. With the corner triangles, those triangles on the corner of the quilt, those we need to fold in half and fold the block in half and line up that crease we made with the center of the triangle and the center of the block. We need to line that up together and sew our 1/4 inch seam. All right, so I have the first section sewn and then a row sewn, and we're going to add that first little section that we started with onto the row. And it kind of feels weird doing this. The way it lines up is kind of odd, but I'm going to show you how I do it to get it right every single time. So we have the two sections lined up together, and what we want to focus on is this half square triangle, this square here, to line up with this square here, and that will help us get everything nice and straight. So here when we lay this together, we're going to line up the seams, and the seams here are going to nest nicely. They're pressed in opposite directions. So I'm going to put a pin in there because I can feel them lined up together. So I'm going to put a pin in there so they stay locked in place. And then I'm going to come over and just make sure this is lined up and smoothed out. And you see here, this is what throws me off, is that the edges there, they don't meet perfectly. They go past each other. And we actually want it to do that. The reason we want it to do that is because we'll be able to trim down to either a 1/4 inch seam, or if your binding's a 1/2 inch, you can trim off a little bit more so you keep the points at the edge of the quilt. We want it to do that, but for me, it just plays with my mind that things aren't lining up right. I'm so used to, in quilting and sewing straight rows together, everything's supposed to line up right. Here they don't. So you kind of have to let go of that a little bit for it to all come together. So I'm going to put a few pins in here so it holds together nicely. And then we're going to come over here, and this block over here, we want it to line up too. One thing though that I always struggle with is I'm never sure how to press my seams with these. And so sometimes I'm going to have to repress them. So I'm going to choose to press this one over the other way so that these seams can lock in place too. And this is another area kind of where this takes a little more time, because I'm going to take the time to repress one of these seams so that things lock together nicely. And instead of agonize overing it while I'm sewing everything and wondering which way I need to press all these seams, I'm just going to kind of go with the flow and press them as I need to and fix them as I need to. That may add on a little bit more time, but it makes it a little less stressful for me. All right, so I fixed the way that seam is laying, and now this locks together perfectly here. So I'm gonna pop a pin in there, and then I'll add some here as well to keep this nice and even. And then we're gonna move that over, and you see we have some of that point on the triangle hanging over there, and that is all right. It is supposed to do that, so we're not gonna worry about it. But focusing on those seams in that block of the row helps keep this all lined up. And like I said a million times already, the edge of the quilt is all going to come together in the end when we trim up after quilting everything. All right, so I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along here and press it. All right, so let me know in the comments if you found this helpful or there were any tips within here for bringing together a quilt on point. If you have any other tips you would like to add, please add them down in the comments. It will be so helpful for me, and I'm sure others. Get the whole quilt top sewn together, and then we are going to table baste this quilt. All right, so we are going to baste this quilt. I have my backing fabric pieced together and on this 6-foot folding table. I line the seam of the backing fabric up with the crease in the folding table. It helps me center everything. Now I have the right side of the fabric facing down to the table and the wrong side is up. What I use to baste quilts is some bandy clamps. So I use these to hold the fabric together on the table. So I have those, and then I use pins. Now I just use some curved safety pins most of the time. I find that it works the best for me. I did get these Wonder pins that I found. They are Clover Wonder pins, and you're supposed to be able to open and close them with one hand. So you're not supposed to, you're not supposed to have to like really fiddle with them to open them. So I'm going to give those a try and see how they work. A lot of people in the comments of my last video, the Argyle video, and the notions that I'm no longer going to use anymore, said that they would love to use safety pins, but they have arthritis. It's hard to open and close them. and doing a ton of them makes it harder. Now these are more expensive, only 20 come in this pack, but I'm gonna give them a try just because you could use them over and over, so maybe that'll be a good alternative if you can buy some a little bit as you go. So let me put the clamps around here. So I probably honestly should use more clamps than what I do, but I work pretty slow when I'm doing this. I put 2 on each of the longer sides and 1 on the end. All right, and so now I am going to lay the batting out. Just gonna sort of gently fold it out over the table, and then I will smooth it as I work and unclamp each clamp one at a time and hold the batting in place that way. The reason I only unclamp one at a time is because I'm going to need to smooth this out as I work, right? So as I smooth the batting, the other clamps will help hold everything in place. All right, and then we're sort of gonna do the same thing with the top of the quilt. Lay it out and put it across the table, unclamp each clamp as you go. If it doesn't reach down to the clamps at the end of the tables, that is okay. Everything should be held in place either way. All right, so let's take a look at these clover pins first. They are definitely a lot smaller than my curved safety pins. I don't think so much that will matter because as long as they work, right? If they're holding fabric in place, then they work. So what you do is press down with them and they will pop open, and you're supposed to just be able to use one hand, put it through everything and put it down. You don't have to use as much of your grip strength as you do with the regular safety pins. And I think that's pretty smart. I like the idea behind them. They're just a lot more money. So here are the 2 different pins side by side. I use the larger curved pins. And then with these, all you need to do is press down, it opens, and just swoop it through and close. So I think it's really, really smart. I don't think you have to use as much pressure as with the other safety pins. But still, you know, I don't have arthritis in my hand, so knowing which one would work better for someone who has arthritis or any other strength issues is hard for me to say. But I do think these are definitely easier to use. They're just more money. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get the top of this quilt all pinned, and then I will show you how I slide the quilt from side to side to get the part of the quilt that is not on top of the table quilted. All right, so now that the top of the quilt is all pinned, it's time to move it to the side so we can pin the side that hasn't been pinned yet. So just remove the clamps. I'm gonna pull the quilt toward me first, so I put all the clamps lined up where the pins ended so that I know when to stop pulling, and the weight from the clamps I feel like kind of helps keep everything even. So I take 2 sides at a time and just gently try to pull as even as I can. So I don't yank it really fast, and I'm just waiting for either the clamps to get all the way to me or to start seeing the edge of the quilt. Because if I see the edge of the quilt, then I know I can pin to the end. So there wasn't that much hanging over, so I'm going to add the 2 clamps on this side. And then I'm going to clamp on the side over here. And then I'm just going to start smoothing everything out. I'll also take under here, pull this to make sure it's And I'm not pulling hard, just gently to make sure everything's even. Smooth out the quilt. And then I'm going to put the clamps back. Over here, smooth everything out. Then after I get everything pinned over here, fill everything in, I will pull the other side all the way up to the top and do the same thing. So it's actually pretty easy to pin a quilt on a table. It's just, you know, if you've never done it before, of course, there's a little bit that you want to learn, and it's a little bit different than doing the basting on the floor or something like that. But I do feel like it's a lot easier for me because then I don't have to crawl around on the floor. One of the problems I always had is getting the right tape to tape to the floor. We have wooden floors, so if you use too strong of a tape, it'll kind of pull up some of the polish on the floor. And then when I had tile floors, that was even harder on my knees. But the tape didn't quite want to stick to that because it was kind of smooth. So there was just always problems with it coming up. Here with the clamps, it's just really easy for me to get it basted. And if you absolutely don't like the idea of pins, you can spray baste this way as well. You just kind of add the spray to the quilt as you do each layer, and it's pretty simple that way as well. All right, so I'm going to get the whole quilt basted, and then I will show you how I'm going to quilt this quilt. I'm actually going to do some machine quilting on it, which I will show you, and then I'm going to do a little bit of hand quilting as well, so I will share that with you too. All right, so I am all set up for straight line quilting. I have my quilt basted and pinned. I have my sewing machine set up with the thread that I want to use. I'm using just a gray thread since there's a lot of white and gray and black in this quilt, so I think it will blend in nicely. I have my stitch length extended up just 2 notches past 3 this time. You can see I have my scant 1/4 inch foot on here. I didn't put my walking foot on because I want to get pretty close to the seam here. I'm going to sew along both sides of all of the diagonal seams on the quilt. I'm not going to go along the seams joining the half square triangles together, just the diagonal seams, and then I'm going to do some hand quilting as well. So I'm just going to start quilting across here. You see I have my quilt pulled all up on my shoulder to try to reduce some drag. If your machine is able to, and if you are just using just a regular foot on your machine, on mine I can raise the presser foot a little bit if I need to, if I feel that it's getting a little tight. But on this sewing machine, the TL18 QVP from Juki, it really does a very good job on thick seams on its own. It has this micro adjuster, I think is what it's called, so the foot will raise and lower over thick seams on its own. It's pretty impressive. So I'm going to start quilting across here. It's always a good idea before you get too far to look and make sure your stitches are looking the way you had hoped they would look. You don't want to get really far in and see that something's not right, that that you didn't thread properly and the tension's off. I like to check right away. If I'm doing anything like free motion quilting, I'll test on another piece of sandwich fabrics that are similar to what I'm using just to make sure everything's right. But it's always good to check. But honestly, the biggest thing I think it's important to remember when quilting your own quilts on a domestic machine is to adjust, and make sure you don't feel the weight of the quilt. You want to have it pulled up on you, held up in some way that you don't feel the drag on the needle. If you feel that drag, if you feel that resistance, if the fabric isn't wanting to move through the machine smoothly, you're not going to get nice even stitches, and that's what we're really looking for, isn't it? Like that's what looks appealing to our eye. So For me, that's pulling the quilt up on me, stopping when I need to adjust my hands to feed everything through nicely, and that works really well. If there are any pins in my way, I just pull those out and keep sewing. Something that's really helpful too is on this machine, you can set it up so that the needle's down when you stop sewing. Mine does that automatically. If yours doesn't, when you need to stop to adjust, it's really important to use the hand crank on the side of the machine to put the needle down where you've stopped sewing. If you don't, when you're adjusting the quilt, if the needle's up, it's going to move. Your fabric's going to move where it is, and you'll start sewing somewhere else, or you'll have to try to get back there. The thread's going to be long because it's moved out of the way, and you're not going to get those nice pretty stitches. So you spend all the time piecing the quilt, getting it perfect. Do everything you can to make this step not so stressful. So needle down position as you adjust or pull out pins makes a world of difference. All right, so I started off of the quilt over where the batting is, and I'm ending off the quilt over where the batting is too, so I can just cut all the starts and stops off when I do the binding. That's going to help tack all of my stitches in place at the end. I do this because it's a lot easier. I don't have to sink any threads into the quilt. It's easier to start and stop off the quilt. Something else you may have noticed is that I also didn't start at the end of the quilt, right? I started somewhere in the middle of the quilt along the diagonal so that if I needed to, I could, you know, press out the fabric as I work. If there's any wrinkles in, it's a lot easier to do that if you start in the center of the quilt and work out to the end. So I'm going to sew along the other seam, side of the seam over here. I just personally like the way that looks when you balance the threads on either side of seams. I think it looks really pretty. It's appealing to me. Somewhere fun to go look for different quilting ideas is on Pinterest. I love going and searching there and looking at all the different designs. But for me, the simple quilting of just following along some of the seams in the quilt is just, that's what really catches my eye, and it makes me happy. And it's this quilt's my quilt. I'm putting hand quilting on it. It is my quilt. I'm keeping it. So I'm not sure how well you can see the stitches on camera, but it is so beautiful just following along that seam. I love the way it looks, and it's just a simple, easy way to quilt your quilt. So I'm going to get all of the quilting done along the diagonal seams along each side, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do for hand quilting. All right, so I have the quilt quilted all along the diagonal lines, and it looks amazing. It's so beautiful. I love the way this is turning out. It's just absolutely elegant. And if you wanted to stop with your quilting here, you absolutely can. You can trim up the quilt and bind it and live happily ever after with your gorgeous quilt. Like I said, I'm going to do a bit of hand quilting on it, but first I'm going to trim everything up just so I can get rid of some of the excess batting and backing fabric, and it'll just make it a little bit easier for me to move it around as I quilt it. I keep this really simple. You buy into all the quilting police stuff and need to do things perfect. This is not going to be the tutorial for you showing you how to trim this quilt up. I feel like if I'm making this for me or just giving it away to someone as a gift, most people are not going to notice if the top of the quilt is a 1/4 inch off from the bottom of the quilt unless you're measuring it. I just don't think it's something your eye is going to see. So because of that, it just eliminates stress for me to just cut it the way I want to cut it. This is a process that I enjoy doing, and you know, doing the type of things to make everything perfect in a quilt doesn't always suit my personality to just enjoy the process. So I'm going to show you how I do this. This is not the only way to trim up a quilt. It's just the way I like to do it to keep things simple. All right, so first I find one corner of the quilt and I smooth everything out and make sure there isn't any bumps and there isn't anything folded under the quilt that might get cut that I don't want cut, right? So I start at one corner and I just grab a ruler. So I'm using the Quilter Slidelock. You can use whatever ruler that you have, the longer the better, right? So all I do is just, I mean, it's kind of just silly in a sense, because I'm not doing anything particular, right, that would stand out from anything else. All I do is honestly just line up my ruler, and however I can get the least amount of fabric cut off, but I am trimmed right up to the edge of the quilt top, that's where I cut. I honestly don't do anything fancy. I don't do measurements from anywhere to make sure everything's even. I don't do anything crazy that makes this stand out and get a perfect quilt by doing measurements and 90-degree angles and getting out tape measures everywhere. I just keep it simple. Not that doing it any other way is wrong. This is just what works for me. What works for somebody else and what their mind needs and maybe measuring it and getting it perfect. That just isn't what my personality needs. This is what keeps me enjoying making quilts, by just keeping it simple. So I just line up, like I said, along here and make sure that it looks straight along here. Make sure that there's no extra batting or backing fabric poking out, and I just trim it up where it gets me an even edge. Now, something you could do here is measure out from the points where the triangles all meet and measure out 1/4 inch and measure across there and cut. That'll help even this up really well as well. But this is honestly just what works really well for me, and it's what I have been doing for the past couple years, and it trims up my quilt quite well doing it this way. And I'll save some of this for using in scrap quilts. I peel the batting off and even it all out and put it in my scrap bin. So I'm just going to turn the quilt and do the next side. And I go all the way around the quilt in that same manner, just getting right up against the quilt top and cutting. So here's the quilt all trimmed up with all of the quilting on it that I have done so far. So just the machine quilting. But I'm going to move on to hand quilting this quilt, and I cannot wait to see how it looks with the extra detail on there. All right, so now we're going to move on to the hand quilting. And I am no expert on hand quilting. I will never pretend to be. I have done very little hand quilting, but I do know a few basics that I can share with you if this is something you would like to try. So let's move on to that step if you so choose to put some hand quilting on your quilt. So here are the supplies I'm going to use. I have a pair of scissors, a hair marker, the thread, then I have some needles here. I have a sticker like thimble on here just in case I need it. And then I have a ruler that I marked the line on that I am using to mark my quilt for where I want to quilt the triangles. Because you can see here, I did a few. I'm just doing triangles within the quilt. If you remember back to the inspiration that I shared at the beginning of the video, the quilting on that quilt did have these triangles like this. This is what I'm trying to mimic, but I decided to add a little bit of color to it just to add a little more fun for me. If you saw on my Facebook page or on the community group here on YouTube, I posted a picture asking for some suggestions on what thread I should use, and I got a bunch of different responses on which I should use, but I ended up just going with the blue because blue is one of my favorite colors. I find it calming, and this quilt is going to be mine. So that's the one I ended up going with. It was really hard to choose though because they were all so pretty. All right, so now that we went over what supplies I'm using, let me show you how to get started. So I'm choosing to use this Hera marker because I am always terrified of marking on the top of a quilt because whatever method you use, I feel like it's hit or miss as to whether or not it actually disappears from the quilt. So I'm going to use this marker. I'm able to see it pretty okay, and I know that is one of the worries because it is kind of hard to see sometimes, so you kind of have to be a little bit careful. But I'm lining up that line that I have marked with this sticker that's removable, so it's easy for me to find with the seam on this quilt. And then I'm going to, you really got to use a decent amount of pressure to mark with the hair marker, but it kind of just leaves a crease here that just goes away whenever you wash the quilt. So like I said, it's not super easy to see, but hopefully it's enough where you can see what I'm doing here. And pressure, and I kind of go back and forth a few times to make sure it's on there. This is kind of hard to show on video because typically I would turn the quilt a lot to get these markings, but I'm going to try to leave it even so I know for sure it stays in camera for one. So get that marked. I think I'm on the wrong line. Oops. I put that there and then I marked the wrong line. Good thing I noticed. So I need to go to the second one here. So, well, it'll wash out, but let me double check because, yeah, the second one there. So I marked the wrong one, but I know to go to the second one. Now I'm going to take off a little bit of the thread. I'm just going to try to cut enough to just do the one triangle. So the longer the piece of thread you have, the more it can get tangled up, get knots in it. So I'm just going to do enough to about finish that triangle. The last one I did was at 20 inches and I just had enough to finish it off and tie the knot. So I'm going to do 22 this time to give myself a little more room. All right, so I'm just going to pop a needle on here. I'm using a fairly large needle. I believe I purchased these as a pack for Big Stitch quilting, and I like how sturdy they are. I'm kind of fumbly with smaller things, so I feel like that one fits my hand really nicely. So to tie the knot to start, I just go around my finger. I have the end of the thread on my pointer finger, and then I just go around once, twist my thumb and pointer finger together once, and then pull to get the knot. And you don't want a huge knot because you want it to pop through the fabric here. So I kind of made a messy one that time, but it's fine, it's a knot. So what you're gonna do, and I'm gonna start over here just because I want to remember that I marked this incorrectly and that the farther one out is the one I want to start with. So you're going to start a few inches away and sink your needle in just to the top layer of the quilt and through some of the batting. You don't want to go through the back of the quilt, and then come into where you want to start quilting. You're going to pull the thread through, and your knot's going to get there to the fabric, and I like to place my thumb firmly behind the knot to hold the fabric in place, and then just pull gently until it pops through. Don't keep pulling, just let it get caught in the batting and everything, and get stuck in there. All right, so that's how we get everything started. Now on to the stitches. I don't mind my stitches being big and chunky. If you want smaller, really uniform stitches, you might want to do a smaller needle than what I'm using. I'm using a big clunky needle, and a smaller needle would probably help you get those finer detail stitches. I just like to have fun with this, just like with anything else. I like the way the big chunky stitches look, so that is okay with me. Everyone's going to have different taste on that. So what I would suggest is maybe playing around with some scraps of fabric, put a layer together, and just have fun testing it out and see what works best for you. All right, so to get started, I'm just going to go a little distance away from where that first stitch came out, and what I do is use my thumb to kind of weave back and forth. I try to keep my stitches somewhat even, but if they're not perfect, I don't mind. So I get a couple stitches on there and then pull it through. I usually just quilt on a table like I'm doing now, usually sitting though, but that's what works best for me. Some people like having a loop or something like that that they like to quilt in. I have found this works best for me. It doesn't hurt my wrists as much. So this is what I choose to do. So I just go back and forth. I use my thumb to kind of guide where the needle comes back up and pull it through. And then I always lay it down and kind of make sure everything is looking even, because if you keep it all bunched up, you can accidentally get your stitches too tight where it doesn't lay nice and flat, especially using this method. So I'm just going along where I marked with the hair marker. All right, so when I get to the end here, see, I didn't come back up to the top of the quilt because I ended right where that line is going the other direction. So I just come over here and pop the thread back to the top where I can work with it, going down the next marked line. So now I'm just going to follow up in that direction. All right, I'm going to rotate a little because it's getting a little difficult to sew in that direction. All right, and then we have this last row through here, and then I will show you how I finish off the quilting. All right, so when I get toward the end here, I try to align my stitches so that I come up right around where I started stitching. So I may have to pay closer attention to my stitch length here than I did before, and it worked out really well. So here is how I make my final knot and sink it in to end the hand quilting. So, and you see I don't have a ton of thread left over either, so that worked out really well too. So what I do is I hold close to where the thread is coming out of the last hole there. I loop around once, and then I push my needle through, and I hold down where I did that loop at. So that loop's still there, and this creates a knot. It's a really small knot right there, and then I sink the needle in right next to where my first stitch started, go through batting and just the top layer of the quilt. I don't go through the back of the quilt, and come out, you know, an inch or so away and pull I hold it next to where the knot is, and just, you want to pull really gently and pop the knot through. And there you go. We have a little bit of hand quilting done on a quilt. Now all I do is pull the thread a little firm and snip off right by the fabric and kind of rub my nail across there to let any threads that were poking through fall in and kind of close up that hole a little bit. And there we go. We have just a little bit of thread as waste. Not bad at all. So let me know what you think. How do you feel about hand quilting? Have you tried hand quilting before? Did this make you feel like maybe it was a little bit easier than you thought and something you might want to try to add a little bit of extra fun to a quilt you are working on? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. So I'm going to finish up some more of these triangles and I'll show you how it looks later on, as well as how I add binding onto a quilt. So after getting the hand quilting done on my quilt, the only thing I had left to do was add on the binding. And for me, I keep binding really simple. I just cut 2.5-inch strips and then I sew those strips together end to end with just a straight seam. After I get them all sewn together, I press the seams open and fold the binding in half with wrong sides together and raw edges meeting and press the binding again. Then I sew the binding onto the back of the quilt. Once I go all the way around the quilt, I flip the binding to the front of the quilt and sew it in place. I keep it very, very simple. If you would like a little more of a walkthrough on the binding, I will link a few videos in the description. All right, so my quilt is all finished. I love this simple half square triangle quilt on point. It took just one layer cake to make this quilt, and this was the perfect layer cake to choose. It really has a great impact with the light fabrics and the medium fabrics and the dark fabrics all in that same white, gray, and black color scheme. It just looks amazing. I think it looks so elegant. And I love that when you look at it, you don't at first see that there is a touch of color from the hand quilting thread that I chose. It's just a light blue, so it gives you something else to experience when you look at it for a little bit. I absolutely love how it turned out. I had so many different thread colors to choose from. It was really overwhelming, and I don't really think I would have gone wrong with any of the choices, but I really like how this one turns out. It makes me happy to look at it. So I'm definitely going to add some hand quilting some more of my quilts in the future. What do you think? Are you going to try out some hand quilting on a quilt just to give it a little bit of extra texture and have some fun with it? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!